Okay, wow. I don't think we've had such a large crowd, maybe once before, but I don't think that this is not normal for us. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Remark Institute. I'm the director, Stefanos Geroulanos, and I am your host today. Thank you to Sam Paul for organizing, and thank you to Amy Nguyen for emceeing the event, particularly for the online side as well. We're here to celebrate and to discuss Adam Shatz's new book, The Rebel's Clinic, The Revolutionary Lives of Frantz Fanon. And besides Adam, we have two distinguished speakers with us, the poet and cultural theorist Fred Moten, author of, among many books, In the Break, The Aesthetics of the Black Radical Tradition, The Undercommons, and The Universal Machine, and I think most recently, All That Beauty. Most recently? Not so recently? And also my NYU colleague, both are NYU colleagues, Azadeh Moaveni, who is most recently the author of Guest House for Young Widows Among the Women of ISIS, and also of Honeymoon in Tehran, 2 Years of Love and Danger in Iran, and Adam, of course. Where to begin on your book, Adam? It pretends to be a biography of Frantz Fanon, and it is so much more on top of that. Now, if, like me, you've read Adam's essays for the LRB, for the New York Times Magazine, for the New York Review, for the New Yorker, many of which were published last year in Writers and Missionaries, Essays on the Radical Imagination, you must have wondered how he can pull off this mastery of text and argument and insight across a 450-page book, and the biography, no less, a kind of genre that's not exactly giving itself off to this kind of thinking. And the answer is that he can, and that he succeeds exactly in the task that Marie-Jeanne Manuelon gave him, namely not to chop off Fanon into little pieces. With this, I should note that you should, as you've noticed, also buy it. We have someone from the bookstore right outside the seminar room. Now, the account of Fanon from his earliest days and his studies through and on to his ambassadorial position representing the FLN in Ghana and Congo is consistently fascinating and demanding. I was pulled in from particular expressions that he uses about things that I knew well, elements of the history of psychiatry, or moments when he adumbrates painfully difficult authors like Maurice Merleau-Ponty. And through the two, psychiatry and philosophy of the body, he manages to move toward, well, I wanted to say differently. I want to say that through, I mentioned these two, because through them, psychiatry and philosophy of the body, he manages to think at the same time, not only psychiatry and suffering, alienation and disalienation, but also revolution, the body violated, and the body of the rebel. Now, I'm particularly moved by the way that the book is at once an essay and a really careful meditation on what it means to be an embodied actor, a spokesman and leader in an anti-colonial revolution, but with this embodied angle at the same time. And also what it meant to be Fanon. I'm going to steal his words for a second from the epilogue to the book and read a few lines before he begins to introduce us, where he writes, Fanon never disavowed his Martinican roots or his love of Césaire's writings, from which he drew his images of slave revolt and the wretched of the earth. And nowhere was Fanon more West Indian than in his writings on Algeria and Africa, in which he transposed the experience of the West Indian plantation onto the entire Third World. It is no accident that labor exploitation plays a far greater role in his account of French colonialism than the civilizational, in inverted commas, or religious conflict between Christian Europe and North African Islam. He had not forgotten his people or his past, but he had come to see both as part of a larger story that connected him to other people and other pasts. Algerians may not have been racially Black, but they were victims of the same system that had brought his ancestors on slave ships to the West Indies. He had left Martinique, but it had never left him. Only a West Indian could have written The Wretched of the Earth. Then he goes on, it was precisely Fanon's defiance of identity's claims, his nomadic commitment to other people's causes, and to a radical anti-colonial form of universalism that enabled him to move readers far beyond Martinique, France, and Algeria, from the Belgian Holocaust survivor Jean Amery and the Catholic mystic Thomas Merton to the young Barack Obama and the political prisoner Alfred Woodfolks. Now, I think I'm going to get out of everyone's way with that and let Adam speak first, and then Azadeh and Fred. I wanted to say one thing in terms of basic rules, given the size of this audience. When you introduce yourselves, please ask a question. Please ask a question. I will cut you off after a minute, so speech is less than welcome, if that's okay. If you want to follow up immediately on somebody else's question, please raise two fingers, but be aware that this will really be like a one-sentence comment. Please do not begin like, let me have like a six-part question with additional comments on the side. So there again, I will cut you off. For those of you who are on Zoom, please put your questions in the Q&A and they're going to reach me accordingly. So Adam.
Thank you, Stefano. Before I launch into my remarks, I want to thank Stefanos. He's a historian of great imagination and endless curiosity who's brought renewed vitality to Remark and made it a home for serious intellectual inquiry and conversation. I admit that when he first invited me to do this event, I hesitated at first because I'm not a trained historian. In fact, as my daughter constantly reminds me, I do not even have a PhD, having dropped out of graduate school nearly 30 years ago. Perhaps another source of hesitation comes from the fact that Remark's founder, Tony Judd, was something of a mentor to me. And whenever I'm here, I feel his presence in the room. Tony never wrote about Frantz Fanon. When he wrote about the Algerian War, he was more likely to quote Raymond Aron or Albert Camus. Still, Tony was, until the end of his much too short life, a work in progress, a critic of intellectual complacency and political conformity. And I'd like to think that he would have ultimately recognized in Fanon a thinker and intellectual whose writings have transformed the global political imagination. When people ask me why Fanon, the answer seems fairly straightforward. He made distinctive and lasting contributions to psychiatry, his chosen profession, to our understanding of how race and racism are lived, to the study and practice of decolonization, particularly as it relates to violence, collective identity, and nationalism. He was not merely a witness to Algeria's struggle for independence, he was also a participant, a spokesman for the FLN in Tunis, and later its traveling ambassador in what was then called Afrique Noire, Black Africa. In his critique of what he called the supremacy of white values and his denunciation of the national bourgeoisies of post-colonial states, and in his warnings against cultural racism, he achieved a rare and startling prescience. He's a specter haunting our conversations about everything from police violence to the repatriation of African art objects to the war in Gaza. He's also, however, more of a disembodied icon than a historical figure, a prophet to some, a villain to others. This is particularly true when it comes to his account of violence in the first chapter of The Wretched of the Earth. Fanon admirers and Fanon haters alike often seem not to have read beyond the first chapter, or rather, the incendiary preface by Jean-Paul Sartre, who declared that for the colonized, to kill a European is to kill two birds with one stone, the oppressor and the man he oppresses. Fanon was, to be sure, a believer in armed struggle in Algeria, where efforts at peaceful reform had repeatedly come up against the obdurate resistance of the Pieds Noirs. But as Hannah Arendt noted, his views about violence were more nuanced than Sartre's and more nuanced than his latter-day admirers on the New Left. And yet it is Fanon, not Sartre, who is still widely seen as an uncritical champion of violence. Several of my reviewers have taken me to task for failing to emphasize his sanguinary impulses, in some cases citing rumors that he slapped his wife, Josie. A radical chic pop music critic in the arts journal 4 Columns, by contrast, accused me of failing to honor Fanon's celebration of violence, a force of collective revolutionary cohesion, he deliriously proclaimed, unaware that in the case of Algeria, violence has divided Algerians nearly as much as it has unified them in the struggle for independence, and that it had come back to haunt them in the civil wars of the 1990s. In Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon wrote that in the West, the Black man's function is to, quote, represent shameful feelings, base instincts, and the dark side of the soul. This appears to be Fanon's function, too, whether he's being vilified or venerated, and the result is the same, the complexity of Fanon's work and life, the contradictions that run through both and that make him such a fascinating figure are flattened. My strongest impulse in pursuing this project was to restore his complexity without, of course, losing sight of the commitments he forged and the visions he projected to the world, to see him as a whole, or rather, in his own words, as nothing but a man. The next question I'm usually asked, if it isn't the first, is, but why you? Never mind that Fanon himself joined a movement that wasn't his own, a struggle for independence not in his native Martinique, but far away in North Africa. Why has an American journalist who's neither Black nor North African, who has no ancestral link to this subject, written a biography of Fanon? It's a good question, come to think of it, and if I were someone else, I'd be asking it too. The answer is that in spite of everything that separates me from the life of Fanon, this subject feels strangely intimate. I first encountered his books in my father's library and their original Grove Press editions. I remember being struck by the intensity of his gaze and by the unusual biography that I read on the jacket of the book of a West Indian psychiatrist who fought for France during World War II and then fought against France during the Algerian War of Independence, becoming a leading theorist of decolonization before dying at 36 of leukemia. I knew only the barest details, but I was already fascinated. I first read Black Skin, White Masks in a French class at Barnard College in 1991, at a time when Fanon was being rediscovered as a serious thinker, not just a pamphleteer. Critical Fanonism, as Henry Louis Gates Jr. called it, was at times an expression of wish fulfillment defined by selective citation. The figure, it imagined, often bore only a passing resemblance to the historical Fanon. As Gates pointed out, critical Fanonists, Edward Said being an exception to the rule, often juxtaposed him with thinkers he had little in common with, such as Lacan and Foucault, rather than with the thinkers he was actually in dialogue with, such as Sartre, the poet Aimé Césaire, who was his mentor, the Tunisian Jewish thinker Albert Memmi, and the radical Catalan psychiatrist François Tosquelles, his mentor at the Saint-Alban Asylum. But critical Fanonism put Fanon back on the intellectual map at a time when the only people reading him seriously in this country were Black American psychiatrists, activists, and writers, the people who, it should be emphasized, resurrected Fanon after his death and protected his work from the condescension of posterity. What struck me when I first read Fanon in French, and what still strikes me now, is the intense shifting of registers in that book, from the visceral to the analytic, from the diagnostic to the expressive. Fanon was highly sophisticated, even something of a show-off, but he was also vulnerable and anguished, an écorché vif, as some described him. You could sense that there was a man in great pain beyond this dazzling mastery of psychiatry, philosophy, and existentialism. And the central chapter of the book, The Lived Experience of the Black Man, gave an account of the impact of racism that resonated with my own childhood encounters with anti-Semitism, evoking that now famous scene in which a white boy sees Fanon in a train and clutches his mother, trembling with fear. Fanon captures the way being fixed by the white gaze left him feeling as if he were alienated from his own body, transformed suddenly into an object under a punitive microscope, suddenly ejected from the human community, from the French Republic, of which he imagined himself merely another citizen. A Frenchman of color, not, for heaven's sake, a nègre. At first, he feels paralyzed. Then he feels as if he's about to explode, like Bigger Thomas in Native Son. And Shatz was a reader of Richard Wright. Hard as it is to imagine, I reacted to one of my own experiences as a child by attacking one of my tormentors. I wasn't Black, but what Fanon had to say about the lived experience of racism made instant sense to me. When I became a journalist, Fanon would help me to understand the places that were coming to preoccupy me. His description of the dynamics of colonial struggle helped to illuminate the struggle in Israel-Palestine, something that I'd become concerned about in my teens during the first Intifada. Reporting from Algeria just after the Civil War, I spoke with young intellectuals who read Fanon not because of his defense of armed struggle, but rather because of his warnings about the corruptions of post-colonial elites and his belief in a multi-ethnic secular Algeria. Although Fanon had been a loyalist in the movement that had created the system they loathed, he represented a road not taken. In the early aughts, Fanon was the subject of two biographies by David Macy and Alice Cherki, his intern in Blida and later in Tunis. I reviewed Macy's biography for the Times and interviewed Cherki in Paris in 2001. These books are both excellent, but I found Macy's book somewhat sterile for all its thoroughness and Cherki's rather too reverential. I wanted to tell the story of Fanon's life as an adventure of both body and soul, as a tragic passion unfolding against the extreme situations he faced, that in a sense he sought out in Martinique, in France, in Algeria, in Tunisia, in Africa. My book is not as exhaustive as Macy's, nor did I have the advantage of knowing Fanon personally, as Alice Cherki did, but I've tried to produce a work of greater emotional and intellectual intimacy. This wasn't easy. The Fanon archives at EMEC, a research library in Normandy, are slender. To bring out this tragic passion, I've foregrounded the contradictions that he never resolved, contradictions that reveal the tensions between thinking and acting, between psychiatry as a practice of healing and revolution as a practice of violence, between analysis and advocacy, between the wounds of history and the will to transform it, between prose and poetry. In sketching this portrait, I've benefited richly from my conversations with people who knew Fanon, including Cherki, the Algerian historian and former FLN activist Mohamed Harbi, who knew Fanon in Tunis, the Tunisian Jewish journalist Guy Sitbon, the American activist Elaine Klein-Moktefi, and above all, Fanon's secretary, whom Stephanos mentioned earlier, the late Marie-Jeanne Manuelon, with whom I spent many hours before her death in 2019. And it was through the eyes of Marie-Jeanne, who typed all of Fanon's manuscripts in the late 50s and early 60s, that I was able to see a different Fanon, passionate to be sure, but also volatile, capricious, and vulnerable. My access to Fanon was also enormously facilitated by the publications of Writings on Alienation and Freedom, a vast and breathtaking compendium of his uncollected writings, including psychiatric studies, plays he'd written as a student in Lyon, and previously unpublished political writings from the the FLN's newspaper, El Mujahid. This volume, edited by Jean Calfa and Robert Young, who is with us here today, was a revelation. It showed other facets of Fanon, the doctor, the psychiatric thinker and reformer, the youthful bohemian writer, the intellectual polemicist. There were, of course, political motivations for writing this book. I began this book in 2017 at the height of the Trump era, and against the backdrop of police violence, the rise of Black Lives Matter, the refugee crisis, the resurgence of white nationalism in Europe and the States. While the heroic era of decolonization is over, its embers could still be felt in the banlieue, in Gaza, in the dangerous passages taken by refugees and immigrants seeking to cross the Mediterranean and the US-Mexico border. The European colonial empires have crumbled, but the divisions between the rich world and the poor world persist. Consider, for example, the starkly different reactions to the wars in Ukraine and Gaza and the global North and the global South. In one important way, Fanon is very distant from our times, and that is in his optimism. For all the bleakness of his analyses of the scars inflicted by racism, of the indignities of colonialism, of the anti-Black racism of the white Western world, Fanon had a very strong and inspiring belief in new departures, in a liberated future where everyone would have a place at the rendezvous of conquest, the rendezvous of victory, in the words of Aimé Césaire. The fatalism of today's political cultures on both left and right was utterly foreign to him. He was not resigned. He believed in action, and he believed that through action, a new humanity could be forged. Black Skin, White Mask concludes with a prayer of sorts. Oh, my body, make of me always a man who questions. In this book, I explore the questions that Fanon asked, as well as the answers he proposed for ending oppression and giving the oppressed a sense of power over their destinies. These answers are sometimes contentious, of course, above all the myth of violence as a shock therapy for the colonized. I do not tell this story as the life of a prophet. That is something for followers, not biographers. I do not see his answers as illuminations, but rather as decisions made in the heat of struggle and in the fog of war. In some cases, these decisions were made under the pressure of representing a political movement. Let's remember that Fanon became a bureaucrat in a liberation movement that was also highly authoritarian, which meant a sacrifice of freedom, a compromise in some cases with his own principles. I am moved by Fanon's life, by the pathos of his struggle, by his fiercely poetic and sometimes by the fiercely poetic and sometimes violent beauty of his writing, and by his physical courage, by his commitment to victims of colonial injustice, by his commitment to his patients, mentally ill men and women, the alienated, incarcerated in institutions where they were deprived of freedom. I hope that you too will be moved by Fanon as I have depicted him, a man of flaws, yes, but a man of even more enormous gifts. Thank you very much.
We didn't really discuss an order before. Do you have a preference as to how to go? Yes.
Well, thank you very much to Stefanos and Remark for convening this. It's really such an honor to be here discussing Adam's book and alongside Fred. So it's really my great pleasure. Thank you. We've been in contact for the years that you've been working on this book. And so I have to admit that I had very high expectations and great anticipation for it. To me, it was not at all surprising that you would write about Fanon. So many of the themes in what is really a vast and panoramic book resonate with other subjects in your writing. So to me, it was a natural focus for you. At the same time, in the course of, I think it was 6 years that you've been working on it, Fanon's cultural traction seemed to grow, and I was sort of observing that thinking of you, partly as a result or a reflection of the social justice movements of our recent times, the demise of jihadism, which in some ways, especially in North Africa and the Middle East, was the sort of last and failed iteration of liberation movements in the post-Arab Spring era. He was making increasing appearances in popular culture, the pool cameo in White Lotus that you've noticed, and I thought of you and I thought, oh God, even greater anticipation. So when it came this summer, I was just delighted as I started to read it that it lives up entirely to all of my expectations. It is an extraordinary book. Like all of your writing, I think it is very passionate and very erudite. But what strikes me the most is that it is very wise and empathetic, and it is very humanizing to the complexities that Fanon presents to us. And in that way, to me, it is very distinct. It was also the fate of the book to be published at a time when the conflict in Palestine and Israel has exploded. And I feel like the reception of the book, the discussion and the thinking about it has been right up against the news cycle and really horrific violence. And I'm struck by the sort of war on terror lens that some of the critical pieces and reception to the book have sort of resorted to. It feels like we're 15 years ago sometimes when I read the reviews, which I was reading ahead of today, a suggestion, and this is by largely liberal writers and journalists, that perhaps there should be a warning label on Fanon. Is he not just the sort of secular Anwar al-Awlaki, the sort of so-called theoretician of Qaeda? I mean, there's a sort of theme running through some of the reception that seems very alarmed that he retains a really important appeal and relevance. The invocations of the allegations of abuse against his wife in many of these pieces sort of reminded me of the fate of Tariq Ramadan in France, and I don't know if that's apt, but it brought it to mind for me. So the responses at this moment to the book are very much tied to our present moment. But it's remarkable to me that they kind of reproduce the vulgarizing and flattening tendencies that you wrote so wonderfully against. So my 3 points that I will sort of just make in my short remarks. The first is around the power dynamics of interpreting Fanon and the power dynamics of translation. I think the book is so much about power and the relational power between citizen and colonizer, between different types of citizens and that same colonizer, citizens and the liberation movement, often very authoritarian, that speak in their name, but also in the power relation of the observer and the critic around responding to the core nature and views of anti-colonial writing about violence. And I think one of the great accomplishments of your book is to hold all of this up, to sort of reveal all of those power relations. And you do that through focusing very closely on the form of what Fanon actually said and wrote. I particularly admired your discussion around how to translate one of the key passages in Wretched of the Earth. That, of course, iconic passage around the necessary nature of revolutionary violence. Often that line is translated as calling violence a cleansing force, but you argue for disintoxicating. And this choice, to my mind, is a fraught choice, and it is a very profound choice to land where you landed. I come from an Iranian intellectual tradition that is preoccupied with a similar terminology, the idea of West toxification by the thinker Jalal Ahmad, who was influenced by Fanon. So the idea of being made toxic by the West is something that goes through that sort of revolutionary tradition in Iran in the 70s. So the notion that that would be rendered as, or a line like that would be rendered as cleansing, to me is very alien. Cleansing carries with it a sense of deliberation and choice. You can choose to cleanse yourself or perhaps not. A sense of moral approval, whereas disintoxication or disintoxifying is very different. It is essentially non-voluntary. If you are intoxicated, you have no choice but to purge the toxins from your psyche and your body in order to survive. You are not unclean, you are made sick. So this is not a process rendered as you have it that invites approval or moralism or even interpretation. It is essentially a clinical diagnosis. The second point that I found really resonant, it's one of the inflections, your inflections in this book, is in when you're exploring the drives that propelled Fanon and his desire for leadership and heroism, essentially being the sort of key diplomat or envoy of the revolution. You emphasize his desire for inclusion and belonging in a movement, but the way that he carries the zeal and the intensity of a convert, how he takes that into his radicalism, and sort of brings the convert's zeal for a tribute. And that is so resonant with many converts who arrive into militant movements. And I found this very perceptive. It's sort of reflective of the fluidity as well, through which militants can wander into each other's movements and projects, bringing wounds of different origins, different agendas. And we see this in so many contexts, the Algerian militants who turned up to direct movements and insurgencies in Mali and Nigeria, differently, but in some ways relevant, the European converts to Islam who joined the Islamic State and were often the most zealous and the most violent. The third point I wanted to make, and this was just to highlight what for me was one of the great pleasures of the book, because the book is beautiful to read and it is a great read. And that was the inclusion of these pen portraits of different intellectuals and friends and comrades in the struggle and colleagues in Fanon's social milieu, especially in the Tunis years. Some of them are just intellectual counterpoints. Perhaps their lives did not intersect with Fanon, maybe had never met him. In one case that I'll mention had not, but whose experiences, the way you sort of reproduce them alongside his, are so illuminating. And I found that the inclusion of these very finely developed characters kind of conjures a portrait, this atmosphere of those cities in that time. And that is a time that has been lost. It's one of the subtle ways the book shows us what was lost with the great liberation movements of the 20th century, the multicultural makeup of cities like Tunis and Algiers and Cairo and Baghdad and even Tehran, I would say. So it, like through those portraits, you kind of take us into the flight of not just Arab intellectuals of Jewish or Armenian or Christian origin, but also some of the Western educated elites, the national bourgeoisie that Fanon deplored, but who were also the technocrats and the liberals who were driven out by some of those authoritarian forces, who at times simply wanted to take their place and take their houses and their positions in the name of the revolution, and ended up offering much less to the nation in their place. The character of Albert Memmi stood out for me in particular, the Tunisian Jewish anti-colonialist writer who was very committed to the opposition and the struggle. He took part in it, and then afterwards he sold his house and moved to Paris. And you include him writing or saying, I belong to a French culture and it's too late for me to espouse a hatred or a pure anti-French passion that I don't feel. And so he took part in a movement that he knew would transform the country into a place where he would no longer belong or feel at his ease. And he said, historical responsibility and interest don't always coincide. So sort of poignancy of what was lost, I feel, is also threaded throughout this. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Elsa. That was beautiful.
Well, first of all, I'm very glad to be here. I appreciate the invitation, and especially on such a great occasion. I've too, like many others, been long anticipating, waiting for your book, Adam, and it's absolutely worth the wait. So thank you so much for the work that you've done. Oh, I'm sorry. I was just saying thank you. So, so there's a kind of interesting problem that this specific occasion kind of produces, because of course in writing about in being, we're here to celebrate and also to study with Adam on the occasion of the publication of this book, but insofar as it is a biography, to celebrate and study with Adam is also of necessity to celebrate and study with Fanon. So there's an immediate question concerning who and what it is that we're actually supposed to be talking about here today. And for me, I think that that's an instructive thing that shows up for me in relation not only to Fanon's work, but also in relation to Adam's other work too, and particularly the extraordinary body of music criticism that he's been offering us over the last 20 years. And so I wanted to sort of begin with trying to tease out, or maybe offer or try to formulate with all of you a little bit better description of this problem that emerges. So if the occasion of a biography of Fanon, and if the occasion of a discussion of a biography of Fanon raises the question of who or what we're talking about, right? Maybe that's a question to really linger on. And maybe it is a question that both Adam and Fanon have both intensely been trying to address. One way to think about it is by way of a crucial term in Fanon's work that he introduces in Black Skin, White Mass, and that term is sociogeny. And the person who's most responsible, I think, for the revival of a more general concern with this notion of sociogeny is Sylvia Wynter, who wrote a great sort of epic essay called Towards the Sociogenic Principle. And what I want to do is, I'm sure that what I'll have to offer can't help but be a sort of deviant understanding of Wynter's understanding of Fanon. Fanon is concerned with the old distinction that Freud makes much of between ontogeny and phylogeny. Ontogeny being, the study of the development of an individual, and in this, common instance, an individual human being that imagines that development can be understood, without reference to some sort of external force, or largely without reference. at least. And whereas phylogeny is the study of groups and of human groupings. Now the question of what the constitution of a group is more complicated. It seems to already imply the individual, right? But and hence the difficulty, but also the extraordinary sort of chance that emerges by way of this term sociogeny. When Fanon formulates it, he's interested in precisely how it is that social forces do in fact have an impact on the development of both individuals and groups. Right? I guess what I'm interested in the term sociogeny is again a certain deviance from that, in which we might begin to think about the social, okay, or sociality outside of, or at least without the immediate assumption of a prior individuation. Okay. Again, that for me closes in on the question, who are we talking about? What are we talking about? This biography, like all good biographies, is so committed to the close analysis and reading of the complexity of its protagonist, that the protagonist disperses into the social. There's a way of looking so closely that the object, what if it turns out to be the case that the end of close looking is the disappearance of the object that you're looking at? Disappearance is not the word I want to validate. I said two words. I said dispersal in the first instance and disappearance on the other. They're both operative, but I have a preference for dispersal. Which is to say, it is not that what one might call the materiality, the historical, the biological materiality of the protagonist disappears, but rather disperses. It fades or folds itself back into a sociality that is both prior to that individuation, but after the fact of that individuation as well, giving us a way of understanding Fanon not only as a character whose particularity we have to understand, but as a kind of as an active force, right, in this ongoing making of the social in which we are engaged. There's a great book by a literary critic named Marta Figlerowicz, who teaches at Yale, and it's called Flat Protagonists. And in this book, she says basically that we all know about characters in novels who start out simply, but who over the course of time we are allowed to be made aware of a greater and greater level of complexity for these characters, so that they arise, as it were, into a kind of vertical dimensionality. They begin to stand. And you could even say that this erection of the character is something that we could talk about under the rubric of Bildung, right? We have a picture of them, but that picture is one that allows us to think about it in terms of depth, perspective, complexity. What Figlerowicz wants to do is to valorize another kind of character, a character whose specific complexities become less interesting over the course of the novel. And in that flatness, in that increasing flattening, right, a social field begins to emerge. And so what I want to say, even though it's against the grain of the kinds of compliments that we usually want to give to biographies, in which we say, oh, you've really achieved a really great picture of the complexity of this figure, and even against the grain of your stated desire, I want to say that, in fact, the intensity of your desire to understand Fanon's complexity has the salutary effect of flattening Fanon and dispersing him out into the social world. This is an interesting problematic because, for instance, and I think it shows up in all these cool ways. So there's moments where you say something like, man, he's elusive, you know, it's a biography that is not predicated on the idea that we can know everything about this man, right? He remains mysterious. His childhood remains largely buried for us. This is an interesting problematic because a particular moment of childhood is so crucial, not Fanon's, but, and so I wanted to, and I'm only going to go for a couple more minutes. I'm trying to be, and I've been, if you saw me, and if it looked like I was texting, it's just because I'm taking notes. This is how I take notes now. And I have, this is my memory, my external memory. So, so this will seem like a little bit of a detour, but it's not. I want to read you two poems. Okay. First is a famous, maybe, I don't know, I hope it's famous, but I hope it's famous enough so that you all know it. It's a great little poem by the key figure in the Harlem Renaissance named Countee Cullen. The poem is called Incident. It was published first in a book, in his first book, which was called Color, published in 1925. Cullen's an NYU alumnus, if anybody cares. And he, again, a sort of central figure in the Harlem Renaissance, was at one point W.B. Du Bois's son-in-law.
Which was improbable because he was gay.
It's it's complicated, you know, there's a fluidity, let's say, you know, but no, but it's an
Don't want to
interesting,
flatten him.
well, but maybe we do, which is to say,
Yeah.
because of course, let's say the emergence of a specific and particular identity that we would call gay, right, is, you know, and it's like, it's more, it's, and of course, the whole point of flatness is not that, is what we often think we mean by flatness is like something like this table is a kind of smoothness, but in fact, in Figueroa's terms, what flatness really gives us is extraordinarily rich topological diversity or topographical diversity. It's bumpy. There's folds, there's recesses, there's texture in flatness. Here's the poem. Once riding in old Baltimore, heart filled, head filled with glee, I saw a Baltimorean keep looking straight at me. Now I was 8 and very small, and he was no whit bigger. And so I smiled, but he poked out his tongue and called me nigger. I saw the whole of Baltimore from May until December. Of all the things that happened there, that's all that I remember.
Mm.
That scene, which Cullen writes in the early 20s, supposedly about a scene that occurred when he was a small child, when he was 8, is of course a prefiguration of the famous scene in Fanon in which the young child in fear calls him the French equivalent of nigger. What's key, what's crucial, is how it is that this particular kind of incident comes to be a fundamental, and you know, like all fake couplet scholars, I'm constantly seduced and then trying to correct myself with, you know, when certain weird phonic anomalies occur, you know. So I'm always trying to remind myself that when we say Bildung, the German word for picture is built. But I love the fact that it also sounds like building. Okay. And I think this question of three-dimensionality is where these terms converge, right? That a proper picturing, right, is also again about the emergence of a kind of illusion of three-dimensionality, right? That produces for us the figure of the upright individual, right? Okay. And so this is a key moment in Cullen, and it prefigures a key moment in Fanon, this moment of, this is a moment of Bildung and of building. This is a moment in which I come to understand myself through a kind of brutal picturing that is imposed upon me by another. Again, it's what's interesting to me is that it presupposes, okay, a kind of individuation. At the same time that it tries to understand the sociogenic forces that structure and that warp individuation. Okay. What I'm interested in is those elements in Fanon's work in which individuation is not assumed, but disrupted. And what's interesting further is that those moments of disruption of the prior assumption of individuation occur at the intersection of what in the last chapter of Wretched of the Earth he'll call anti-colonial struggle and mental disorder. The flattening of character could be understood as a kind of breakdown of personality. What I think I love in Fanon is how his work moves and points towards a kind of revolutionary practice that is bound up with a certain generalization, or even which could be understood as a dispersal of personality. In other words, another way to think about it is, I'm interested in how Fanon's work, which I think could easily and rightly be and should be understood as squarely within a liberal humanist tradition, okay, allows us to recognize that our most radical discourses on revolution are also part of a liberal and humanist tradition. But Fanon also requires and allows us to see the limits of that liberal and humanist tradition and what might be on the other side of that liberal and humanist tradition, right? And again, what's on the other side of it has to do with this flattening and dispersal, and not just the sociogenic, but the sociological. And this gets back to music. Okay, and I'm almost done. What I think is amazing, there's this moment early on in the book where I'm imagining it, because I got a advanced copy, so I don't know if there was like a missing footnote. It's like on page 3 of this paper, but there's a moment where you're describing where Fanon mentions Louis Armstrong, and it solves a little problem that I had always been interested in and I knew was true. Right? There's that horrible, I think, or kind of not horrible, but disheartening moment in On National Culture, I believe, when Fanon is decrying the hiccup, you know, of the lament, you know, the broken down lament of the jazz hiccup of the, you know, the misfortunate Negro. I've always assumed he was talking about Armstrong. I've always assumed that, in fact, he was very interested in a very specific moment in Armstrong's performance history, namely when Armstrong went to Ghana in 1957 and performed at the celebration for Nkrumah's rise to power and the end of what we hoped would have been the end of British colonialism in Ghana. And at that, and one of the pieces that Armstrong sings is, you know, maybe the first great protest song in American popular music, Andy Razzoff and Fats Waller's Black and Blue. And one can see how it is that Fanon would be appalled by such a performance. Like many radicals who emerged in the 1950s and 1960s were appalled by Armstrong's performances, not only because he appeared to embody this poor, misfortunate Negro, but also because internationally it was often, these performances were often at the behest of the State Department, okay, as the U.S. was fighting the cultural Cold War.
Duke Ellington.
So many.
Dizzy Gillespie.
So, but obviously there's a deeper listening. And in a deeper, and one, you know, the two people who I would love most to sit and listen to records with, because I would be trying to do it in an evangelical way, would be Adorno and Fanon. But everything that you most desire is in this music that you don't want to, and specifically in Armstrong. And one way to think about it is that, and it's just this strange conundrum, it emerges in what it is that we mistakenly call the solo, right? Which Ralph Ellison famously sees as a flight, right? An erect emergence out of the social, right? But in fact, okay, and in the interest of something called freedom. But in fact, the solo is always accompanied, even if no one else is playing, right? Okay, you're accompanied at the level of memory, right? The soloist is, in this regard, much better understood as the angel of history, and the flight is really pretty parallel to the ground, right? Not vertical, you know. And you're looking back, okay. So what I'm trying to say is that there's a way in which there's something going on in this music, and in a kind of radical tradition in the music, and what I would also even call a kind of radical clinical tradition in the music that goes from Armstrong to Taylor, and it's not, obviously, not held within the specificities of the American space, right? We can bring other traditions within within African diasporic music to bear on this. But this is what I believe that Fanon is, on the one hand, not quite fully ready to listen to, and at the same time, that movement absolutely infuses his work. And what it opens up for us is, again, a space in which we can begin to follow a radical line that requires us to both honor and call into question the basic tenets of liberalism and humanism. Okay. Which brings me to another poem with which I'll close, by great poet Rita Dove, and it's another music poem, so to speak. It's called Canary. Billie Holiday's burned voice had as many shadows as lights, a mournful candelabra against a sleek piano, the gardenia her signature under that ruined face. Now you're cooking, drummer to bass, magic spoon, magic needle. Take all day if you have to with your mirror and your bracelet of song. Fact is, the invention of women under siege has been to sharpen love in the service of myth. If you can't be free, be a mystery. My sense of it is that as much as Fanon is dedicated to liberation, he is also completely committed to an unraveling of the entanglement that occurs as a function of the fact that liberation and liberalism are all bound up with one another. And I think what your biography shows and what it enacts is that maybe even beyond merging or emerging into a kind of fully erect three-dimensional subjectivity, right? Fanon, in his personal story as well as in his aspirations, is maybe committed even more to mystery than he is to individual freedom or national freedom.
Opacity.
Yeah. So,
Thank you. That was beautiful. Thank you for both of those wonderful and generous and creative responses. Actually, the last time that I was on a panel with Fred, we were honoring Cecil Taylor. What you just said about Armstrong was really incisive and striking, and I think it is possible that that the old godforsaken blues man whom Fanon is evoking in that passage on national culture, is Armstrong. That's possible. And certainly Fanon had a disdain for American jazz musicians for offering their services to the State Department at a time of intensified Cold War rivalry over the fate of these countries that were decolonizing. But I think there's another aspect to that passage, me is very, very interesting, that he is aiming his criticism not at the musician, not at the Armstrong-like figure. He's aiming his criticism at white critics who's to celebrate older Black musicians, Dixieland musicians at a time of radical bebop insurgency. He's celebrating bebop as basically the equivalent of anti-colonialism in sound. And I think there's a remarkable anticipation here of the arguments that Amiri Baraka would develop just a couple of years later, Blues People, where he took on the so-called moldy figs, the predominantly white critics who had praised New Orleans jazz as the authentic form of Black music and regarded bebop as this inauthentic deviation. And to me, the passage reflects less his contempt for like Armstrong than his contempt for those who seek to freeze Black aesthetics in an earlier phase. And so I think there's also a parallel with his criticisms of the negritude, right? He sees Fanon is very influenced by negritude in the mid-late 1940s, after that shattering experience that you described so well on the train. You know, he's in France, he's a student in Lyon, and for the first time, he's reading people like Léopold Senghor and Léon Gontran Damas and Aimé Césaire, whose mayoral campaign he participated in 1946. And these were three rather different expressions of negritude. Senghor's was the most distinct. Senghor had this vision of a mystical, eternal African culture. Famously said that that emotion is Black, just as reason is Hellenic. This is a phrase, of course, that Fanon singles out for mockery in Black Skin, White Masks. But Fanon is quite open about the fact, Black Skin, White Masks, that he had a kind of passionate dance with Senghor's negritude when he was a young man, waded in the irrational. Later on, he becomes much more sympathetic to Césaire's version of negritude, which emphasizes self-invention, self-creation, the future. It's a new world negritude. It's not a negritude of Africa. But still, he's skeptical of negritude's emphasis on culture as a form of political practice. He sees it as having a tendency towards conservatism. And I think those convictions intensify because of the positions that the better known exponents of negritude take on the world stage in the late 1950s. Senghor defends France on the Algerian question. Césaire remains a kind of a stubborn advocate of Martinique's departmentalization, which Fanon had originally supported, but which he begins to see as a repetition of what had happened to Martinique in 1848 when slavery was abolished, but Martinicans essentially free. And so he sees it as the perpetuation of neocolonialism. So for me, that passage says a lot about Fanon's unrepentant modernism. Fanon aligns himself with bebop in defiance of these white critics who want to say, no, this is the true Black culture. And he connects bebop, moreover, explicitly with the struggle against segregation, which is what Baraka does in Blues People. Having said that, I tend to agree with you that
because of his modernism and because of his desire to slay the father, places little value on forms of collective cultural memory. You sort of wonder what is going to nurture these cultural projects of national liberation. And his answers in national culture are pretty skimpy. I mean, he really, all that he has to say is that it's going to emerge out of struggle. And that could leave you with a very barren kind of culture that is not going to persist in the aftermath of revolution. I think it's a weakness in Fanon, I think. And testifies, I think, also to his ambivalence about Martinique, his ambivalence about the West Indies. I mean, there's a reason why Fanon chooses to merge the Algerians. I mean, here, we get to your point about Fanon engaging in a kind of self-flattening, wanting to become one with the Algerians. I think it's because he goes to Algeria. This is late 1953, about 11 months before the Algerian independence struggle breaks out. He's working both with Algerian men and with European women. He's learning about local customs. He's going to the countryside, to the Bled, the Outback, and Kabylia, and observing possession ceremonies where people are cured of madness. And he's impressed because he sees that the Algerians have a much more forgiving attitude towards the individual sufferer than European doctors do. European doctors and Europeans generally tended to blame the sufferer implicitly. You're responsible for your illness. Whereas the Algerians blamed jinn. The possession ceremonies were intended to liberate the sufferer from that jinn. So he's developing infatuation, even a romance. He's falling in love with the Algerian people. And when their struggle breaks out, he sees it as this universal struggle for freedom, for human dignity, and so on. And I think that what impressed him most was that the Algerians had refused the mask. The Algerians had not become French, unlike his own people. I mean, Black Skin, White Masks is a scathing critique of racism, but it's also a scathing critique of West Indian political culture and the West Indian desire to assimilate the whiteness. But your point about flattening, actually, I embrace that because, first of all, it would have been extremely difficult, short of fictionalizing, to achieve a richly psychological, three-dimensional Fanon because we only have the most fugitive traces. He had a contempt for people who wrote memoirs. He didn't keep them. His autobiographical writings were few and far between. But moreover, I mean, the reason why I really connect with what you're saying is that Fanon, I wanted to historicize Fanon, to see Fanon in relation to all of these other people who shared his desire to overthrow colonialism and also his desire to put something better in its place. He was one of many, even in his psychiatry and his work on on the concept you mentioned, sociogeny. He was not, I mean, and I admire Sylvie Winter's article I cited in the book. Not alone. There were other French psychiatrists whom he was reading in the pages of Esprit who didn't use the term sociogeny, but essentially that's what they were talking about. These were radical psychiatrists influenced by Marxism and surrealism who were beginning to understand that madness is a collective, not merely an individual one, and that you have to understand social forces and not merely a person's brain. Yeah, I'll respond to what Azadeh said later. Sorry.
So please introduce yourselves when starting up. I'll take the third question.
Hi, my name's Benjamin Walker. It's really nice to be here and celebrate this amazing book. Since you both brought up the reviews, I love your term vulgarization. But yeah, I really want to ask about this because I feel like we're in a moment where we're seeing the most intellectual discourse being controlled over what's going on in the world this moment. And some of the dismissive reviews really feel a part of that almost in terms of like, a biography has the ability to tell us about not just who someone was, but who they could be and what they could mean. And it just feels that some of these reviews kind of speak to that. And I'm wondering what you would say to that.
Well, I think I've been rather lucky, and so I don't want to sound like I'm, complaining. It could have been a lot worse, but no, I mean it's true. That when I was writing this book, I had assumed that it would be read against the backdrop of Black Lives Matter, but of course it got published like shortly after after October 7. And now, of course, it's being read through the prism of the Israeli assault in Gaza. I think it's worth reading Fanon in relation to what we're seeing today. I think that, Fanon, I don't want to speculate on what Fanon would have made of the atrocities that took place against civilians, but I don't think that Fanon would have found it very difficult to understand why people kept in cages for 17 years might respond very violently, very quickly. Something that is, people I think tend to overlook the fact that the wretch of the earth, although obviously he was defending armed struggle as a necessity, that Fanon was also writing pretty fearlessly about some of the darker impulses engendered by colonial violence. And he was writing about a world that had been created by violence. French Algeria was a construction of violence. In 1830, the French had invaded, and over the next 40 years, a third of the Algerian population died of violence, malnutrition. French soldiers would light fires outside of caves where Algerian families had taken refuge and asphyxiate them. These were called enfumades. French Algeria was then, was turned into an administrative part of France, divided into 3 departments in 1848. French Algeria was violent. So in Fanon's view, the response by Algerians was a counter-violence. And I do think that, Fanon would regard Palestinian armed resistance as also a counter-violence. That's not to say that he would endorse every single means adopted. He might well have been horrified by some of them. He expressed great consternation in 1956, just as he was leaving Algeria, about the plague of violence that had engulfed them. He was not merely talking about colonial violence. He also had in mind some of the anti-colonial strategies. For example, in Denying Colonialism, which was published as Year 5 of the Algerian Revolution, Fanon says that we condemn the almost physiological brutality demonstrated by some of our Algerian brothers, an almost physiological brutality that is the result of centuries of oppression and domination. Fanon's view of violence is sometimes, of course, celebratory because it is an affirmation of humanity, which is in fact how the Holocaust survivor and resistance fighter Jean Amery understood it. He wrote very admiringly of Fanon in 1969 in Les Temps Modernes. But at times, Fanon was able to capture the very ugly aspects of anti-colonial violence. And his chapter on violence, in fact, includes warnings. He writes that at the beginning of an anti-colonial struggle, it's only natural for the colonized person to regard any member of the colonizing community as a legitimate target, and to adopt what he calls the primitive Manichaeanism of the colonial system. But eventually, unless the anti-colonial struggle is to descend into murderous rampage, it has to transcend this primitive Manichaeism. Fanon is a Hegelian. It has to transcend that, and it also has to make inroads into the settler community. This is why there's a chapter on the European minority in Denying Colonialism, and to others who might support the struggle and transform it into something other than an assertion of ethno-national power. I think Fanon helps illuminate what we're seeing in a variety of ways, not simply, kind of the flag waving ways that have been proposed by some of his more vulgar readers. And I think there are different Fanons. I mean, there is a vulgar Fanonism, there's a more sophisticated and subtle Fanonism. These are both, by the way, legitimate in my view. There are many ways of reading him, and in my view, Fanon's future as a thinker lies in his specters. And my purpose is not to propose that there is one correct reading. I have my own way of reading him. Others have different ones.
Let me jump ahead and ask a little bit about the new insight. One of the tensest moments in the book concerns the brief period when he is in Congo, when he before the assassination of Lumumba. I was wondering if you would talk about that a little bit.
Sure.
Because it's pretty clear that you're trying to stage multiple ways for us to read it.
Sure. Yeah. Was there any more water, by the way?
Yeah, okay.
Well, the chapter on the Congo actually, I think, calls to mind the title of the book, of the Rebels Clinic, The Revolutionary Lives of Frantz Fanon, because among the tensions, thank you, that I wanted to explore in this book, are the tensions between Fanon as rebel, as dissident, as critic of systems of power, of orthodoxies, and Fanon as revolutionary bureaucrat. Fanon has to make certain sacrifices once he enters the national movement, once he agrees to abide by its orders. Fanon is not setting policies. So there's a fable about Fanon and Fanon's relationship to Lumumba. There's a grain of truth to it. Fanon met Lumumba in 1958 in Accra at the All African Peoples Conference, and they got along. They really liked each other from radically different backgrounds. Lumumba was not a sophisticated French intellectual, but Fanon found much to admire in him. I think he was kind of captivated by Lumumba as a figure, even though Lumumba's own approach to politics was one of nonviolent organizing. He wasn't leading a violent insurrection. So according to this fable, Fanon in 1960, during Lumumba's crisis, weeks before he's removed from power, Fanon goes there to defend his friend. That's not actually what happened. Fanon went to Congo with a delegation of other figures, the RA, the exiled government of the Algerian Republic, and their purpose in going there was to encourage Lumumba to step down, because here Fanon is entering into a very complicated field of geopolitics. The FLN has its headquarters in independent Tunisia, under the auspices, under the protection of the moderate nationalist leader Habib Bourguiba. Bourguiba was not fond of Lumumba. And the Americans, by 1960, were understood that the FLN was going to win the war. Fairly clear by then. And so the FLN wanted to ingratiate itself with the Americans, of course, hated Lumumba and were already planning to bring him down and to kill him. And at the same time, the FLN had to make sure that its relationship with Tunisia, Habib Bourguiba's administration, was solid, because the Army of the Frontiers was based in Tunisia, to some extent in Morocco, but particularly in Tunisia. They needed to continue operating out of Tunisia. So as a result of that, they decided they couldn't pursue a position of defending, Lumumba, and they had to encourage him to step down and form an opposition party. And it's a very sad story, because what you see here is that Fanon is there not to protect or defend Lumumba. He's there to represent the interests of the people whose cause he's adopted, the Algerians. And it's notable that when he's in Rome, in 1961, meeting with Sartre and Beauvoir and Claude Lanzmann. And this is an incident that Simone de Beauvoir writes about very vividly in her memoirs. Fanon begins to blame himself for Lumumba's death. If only Lumumba had taken my advice, he'd still be alive today. He blames himself for the death of Lumumba. He also blames himself for the death of the Algerian independence leader Abban Ramdan, who was the great figure of the Algerian interior, who had been Fanon's mentor. And Abban Ramdan was lured to Morocco and strangled by his comrades. And these were people whom Fanon had to work with on a daily basis. People like Krim Belkacem, the head of the foreign ministry. Fanon knew that Abban Ramdan had not died a hero on the battlefield. He understood this. He also knew that his position was very delicate and that if he stood up for Abban Ramdan after Abban Ramdan's murder, he might be next in line. And he actually was on a list of people who could have been liquidated if there had been an internal challenge to the leadership. So, this book, I think, tries to present a more complicated picture of what it meant for Fanon to operate in this movement, where he was an outsider, and as Azadeh was underlying in her comments, where he had a very strong need to belong. I'm not sure if it was the zeal of the convert. I would say it's more the zeal of the assimilé. I would say that just as he had once desired to assimilate to France as a young man, so now he had transferred these desires to the Algerian cause.
Sorry. Hi, I'm a visiting researcher at Penn. My name is Disha. I wanted to ask a little bit about how you've all observed to some extent that Fanon now has this enduring place in different kinds of canons of thinking about decolonization, about psychiatry, but also about social theory more broadly and universally. And of course, this has implications for how Fanon will continue to be taken up, not just cited, but taken up as forming an apparatus or a method for reading all kinds of things or for critics. And so I wondered if you might say a bit more about how the historicization that's at the heart of your book, and also perhaps this dispersal, what that changes about how you hope that Fanon is taken up as a method for reading or as an apparatus. You referred to Fanon as Hegelian. I think many people today would call various readings Fanonian. Fanon as a method, I guess I'm asking, how do you hope this portrait, historicization and flattening changes that piece of him, with Fanon as, generator of method or of apparatus for more thinking?
Fanon and Fanonism are obviously two very different things. Fanon was not, in my view, an original theorist. He was a bricoleur. He put together ideas that he found in various different places. Found some of them in phenomenology, some of them in negritude, some of them later, some of them you could say in a kind of Maoism, when he began to defend this idea of the revolutionary spontaneity of the peasantry, some in existentialism, some in phenomenology. And he put these together into a syncretic language that is very distinctive and very Fanonian. Fanonism is something that emerges after his death. And it's something very different. I'm not saying that it bears no relation to Fanon, but I think to some extent what it does is it takes certain aspects of Fanon and turns them into revolutionary catechisms. And which is not to say that Fanon's ideas can't have a very beneficial influence on all manner of things, whether it's political struggle or creation of artworks, film, culture, the practice of psychiatry. I think that some of the developments that have taken place since his death bear witness to that. We know that, for example, there is a psychiatric center in Turin called the Frantz Fanon Center, where psychiatrists drawing upon some of Fanon's ideas, also ideas from other ethnopsychiatrists, are working with poor people, with refugees, with immigrants. And they're applying those ideas in a very dynamic and creative fashion, not as a method. I think that once you turn Fanonism into a method, in some ways, I think you're doing violence to Fanon's project. I mean, there's a reason that Fanon wrote in the last sentence of Black Skin, White Masks, oh, my body makes me always a man who questions. Once Fanonism congeals into method, how do you continue asking those questions? What if the method proves faulty? So, I think there are some readings of Fanon which have that kind of creativity, have that dynamism. I think that, Edward Said's writings on Fanon have a great deal of panache and brilliance and have illuminated aspects of the Palestinian struggle. There are filmmakers who have drawn upon Fanon's ideas with great vividness. One, of course, is Gila Pontecorvo, but there's also Usman Sembene. I mean, his film Black Girl is a deeply Fanonian film. So I don't, I guess I don't really have hopes with regard to Fanonism as method. I'm glad to see that there remains a great deal of interest in the work, that the thinking, that his body of work is a living body of work. And I hope that the book, this narrative of Fanon, as a thinker, as an activist, and as a man, leads people back to the writing, but also encourages them to think in a more supple way about subtext of the writing.
One more. Okay, I need to close things out. Thank you so much.
Thank you.